I want to do something here and keep my time in front of me, so honor that. That I was like, should I do, shouldn't I do? And then I decided I should do, so I should. I want to use one of these sessions, and again, a last minute decision, but I think it's a good one. It's something that I'm currently working on a book right now. I don't have a title for it yet, but it's how do you talk to your kids about identity, gender, and sexuality, no matter how old they are? How do you talk to them about it biblically? Like from preschool through college age, what does it look like to have those conversations? So how would that be helpful? Another book I want to write, I don't think too many people will buy, and I'm okay with that. I'm working on a murder mystery right now. I'm on chapter 8. I don't think anybody will ever buy it, nor do I think I'll publish it. It's just for fun. It's about a guy in a donut shop. Never mind. That's a whole, but I really am. I really do that in my spare time. I want to write a book about like how do you preach on gender and sexuality from the Bible. Like I said, I don't think it'll be a bestseller, but I think it's needed because I was talking with somebody in the back there, and he and his wife both said it's a subject that people avoid, and I understand why. It's uncomfortable, right? It's like you're going to preach about sex or money. You're like, hope nobody new comes today, Or like when I was senior pastor, and I would talk about money. I said, hey, good news, bad news. The good news is we're not talking about sex. And we'll just leave it there. Let's go on with a stewardship sermon. But I want to talk to you about how do you preach on gender and sexuality biblically? What does that look like? What are the landmines to avoid? I don't have sermon slides for this or PowerPoint, or we don't call it PowerPoint anymore, do we call it slides or whatever? I don't have technology for it yet, but eventually I will. So anyway, you just take notes over what you want to take notes over, or take notes over nothing. Whatever floats your boat and makes you feel valued. Okay. So how do you begin to preach and think about preaching? And I want to talk about not just crafting the sermon. I want to talk about should you do a sermon series on it? If you did, what does it look like? How do you preach or do a sermon series on it without being creepy? All that kind of stuff. So first and foremost, I'd say the first point is this: it feels like a Monday. Familiarize yourself with the modern context of sexuality and gender. That's the first step. Familiarize yourself with the modern concept of sexuality and gender. Now, about 10 miles away from our church, there's a guy that is known for his joy and excitement about life named John MacArthur. And yeah, that was a joke. He's a great expositor. I love his commentary series. Kind of a sour attitude. I spent a semester at the Master's Seminary before I really knew it was the Master's Seminary. And I got in trouble you had to wear a shirt and tie to class every day. And I got in trouble for wearing a clip-on by a professor. He pulled me aside. He's like, is this really what you want your ministry to be? A clip-on ministry? And I just looked at him and I said, yes. I said, that's exactly what I want. So I think my life would be easier if I was selling clip-on ties. I honestly do. It'd be fantastic. And I just knew it was time to leave, and I left after that conversation. But one of the things that, really that whole school of thought over, and there's much I agree with MacArthur and MacArthurites about, but there are many things I don't agree. Like, I'm not a 5-point Calvinist. I, kind of view dispensationalism as theological pornography to a degree. And so for me, I look at one of the things that he says is that you just need to when you engage somebody about societal issues, you just mainly quote Scripture, and you just mainly tell Scripture to them and all this kind of stuff. And you don't really need to, try to contemporize everything and so on and so forth. Now, I agree with not trying to make the Bible relevant, because the Bible already is relevant. But there are times when we have to show people how the Bible is relevant. I think that's what Jesus did through the parables when he was teaching God's Word. I think that a great example of this is the Apostle Paul in Acts chapter 17. I'm convinced that if the Apostle Paul preached that sermon today, there'd be some of our brothers and sisters who would, to borrow a 1980s and 90s phrase, call it Christianity light. Because Paul didn't even get to Jesus, didn't even name his name till near the end of the sermon. And he quotes two secular songs, or two secular poets in it. And I don't know if Paul and MacArthur would have gotten along when it comes to this issue right here. But both Paul and Jesus, knew enough about society to be able to interact with people. Paul could go toe-to-toe with the Sanhedrin and then toe-to-toe with the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers on the same day, right? Jesus could talk to Nicodemus in John 3, but then talk to the woman at the well in Samaria in John 4. And when you look at the way Paul preached to the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers versus how he presented the gospel to the Sanhedrin, or even Festus, there are some big differences. Why? Because Paul understood his audience. Paul knew what he was talking about. Now, when I say familiarize yourself with the modern context of sexuality and gender, I am not saying that you need to be an expert. You don't need to be an expert, okay? Trust me, you don't. But you need to know enough about it so that when you're up there and you're, speaking, you don't say, in the T, the G, the L, the B, all the alphabets, those people. You don't want to just off the top here, you're like, I wouldn't say that, Caleb. But you can trip up on other things, so you need to know enough about it. You need to know terms and phrases like transgender, non-binary, gender dysphoria, that kind of thing. You need to know how people in your audience might think of gender differently than you do. I personally view it as a synonym with biological sex. But I do understand how a lot of people are being taught right now that they're different, and gender has more to do with society and sociological structures and how you present yourself and how you interact with people and so on and so forth. I'm not an expert in that because I have a life, but at the same time, I know enough about it to where I can mention that, or if somebody has a question afterwards, I can talk to them about it. And when I say familiarize yourself, I'm not saying read a long journal article. It could be a paragraph somewhere, but make sure that you know what you're talking about. Because people, I don't know, some of you, I think everybody in here is old enough to know this, and I'm trying to teach my 17-year-old son right now. He has the annoying trait that maybe some of the people in our congregation do, and that I did when I was his age, and I still do sometimes, according to my wife. But my son's annoying trait right now is he is an expert on everything. Seriously, he has an opinion on things that he has never heard of before. And I'm trying to get him to understand, Joel, there's a lot of wisdom to learn from the Godfather, okay? Never let anyone know everything you're thinking. Sometimes it's just best to be silent and then speak. Your words carry more weight. He's like, well, wouldn't they carry more weight if you spoke more? I'm like, oh my gosh. Yeah. So anyway, we're praying for him. He wants to go to Ozark, so that should be fun for them. Going to have to pair him up with DeFazio to see who knows more then. The son will come home crying, and I'll be like, good job, Michael. Here's a tip. Be happy with DeFazio for doing that and teach him a lesson. Anyway, no, but understand how people use that differently. Now, you can, if this helps you, I will do something for you tonight. If you write down your email address legibly, Let me just say that. And I know it sounds like I'm talking to children. I'm just telling you, some of you, and I mean you, people, okay? I did mean that, exactly how it sounded. Dude, people, you write and you think people can read your handwriting. We can't. Don't do cursive. Give me your email address and I will give you a vocabulary term guide having to do with LGBTQ that I wrote. I wrote it thinking that it was going to be probably 7 pages. It's now 48. So if you want this term guide, just give me your email and I'll send it to you along with some human resources stuff if that's helpful on Title VII and court system and religious stuff and the Equality Act. And by the way, these are documents you do not read like Messy Grace. These are references. If you read them like Messy Grace, you will become depressed, okay? You need to also, as you're familiarizing yourself with the modern context of sexuality and gender, discern the cultural landmines. There are cultural landmines to stay away, like conversion therapy. Stay away from that. Like pray the gay away. That's what I'm talking about, okay? I would say keep this in mind too. The extremists of any community are not the majority. Extremists are always the minority, but they are loud. How many of you know that? The extremists in Christianity. I think of, anybody remember Fred Phelps? You know, the God hates gays guy? That guy, yeah, that protested. Yeah, he's a barrel of monkeys. Actually, I debated him one time on a street corner in Topeka. That's a whole nother conversation. I was bored and I saw him there. So you got to remember that sometimes it's easy to talk about the LGBTQ community. It's not really a community, people. Like, I would never quote this from the pulpit, but Dave Chappelle has a really funny bit. Yeah, he does, where he talks about the L, the G, the B, the T all riding in a car together, and they're not getting along. And they don't get along. Trust me. I was raised by, a gay man and 2 lesbians. And I was not just raised by 2 lesbians. I was raised by angry baby boomer lesbians of the 1980s who wore sweatsuits all of one color and had a fanny pack and wore different pair of white socks with Birkenstocks back when nobody did that whatsoever. I used to have to drive my mom's RAV4. She had awful bumper stickers on it. Like there was one on there that said, Lorena Bobbitt for Surgeon General. And I'm just like, if you don't know what that is, just Google it later. But you should have seen some of the looks that I got when I came to stoplights. People were looking at me and I just went. A couple times I'd go. Not too many times. So you got to remember, the extremists of any community are not the majority, okay? They're always the minority. I would say the average person is probably where you and I want them to be, in the middle. Not in the middle of their theology, but in the middle of, empathy, feeling with people, that kind of a thing. Not agreeing with them, not rejecting them, but feeling with them, like what Jesus said. If somebody forces you to go 1 mile, you go with them 2. You can't walk a mile in somebody's shoes, but you can walk miles next to people. Okay? Number 2, if you're going to do a sermon, you could do a standalone sermon, obviously, on gender and sexuality. You could also create like a sermon series over like identity. Either last year or the year before, Kyle Eidelman did a great job putting together a sermon series. I think they called it Discipleship of Sexuality or something like that. And they just talked about different aspects of sexuality and that kind of a thing. Same-sex relationships was one, but they also talked about lust and they talked about other things like that. When you do this series, number 2, like I said, partner the sermon series with other events. If you're going to do a sermon series on identity or sexuality, have something for parents. Whether it's a parent talk, whether it's a parent night where you let your children's minister, youth minister if you have those, if you don't, Maybe you partner with another church and ask them to come and say something, or maybe you say something to all the kids, as long as it's not creepy. To the parents, because parents need a lot of help right now when it comes to talking to their kids about sexuality and gender. Because I don't know if you know this, this might be a shocker. And this is how it is in California. It might be different here in Illinois. It might be different in Missouri. But this is what I found, that parents, overall, Christian parents, are not really good at discipling their kids. They're not really good at Bible time. They're not really good at devotionals. And I say that not as a Caiaphas up here. I still have a long ways to go. But they're not. And so expecting that they are automatically going to talk to their own kids about sexuality and gender from a biblical standpoint is probably a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. Because our kids and our teenagers are being discipled by this, I don't even know what you call it, this critical theory. And critical theory is something that expands not just critical race theory, but there's queer theory, there's womanist theory, there's liberation theory, there's all these different theories under that, and that is what is shaping the minds of our kids and our teens right now. And so you've got to invest in the parents. Maybe have a Q&A time with parents where they can come and ask questions. But you need to partner the sermon series with other events. Number 3, acknowledge the audience when you preach. Number 3, acknowledge the audience when you preach. Okay? No one LGBTQ plus person is the same as another. Okay? Because where I live, kind of the capital of LGBTQ is West Hollywood, where I live. But there are a lot of, gay people, lesbians, people struggling with gender dysphoria. When you sense incongruence between your biological sex and how you perceive yourself and interacting with other people, we have them that go to Shepherd, even though they know what we believe. They still come. They still attend. I've asked some of my friends that are, I'm like, because I know them well enough where I can ask this question, they wouldn't take offense. I'm like, why is it that you would come here when you know what we believe about, relationships and intimacy and so on and so forth? And you know what their answer is? We don't need to agree with everything a church believes to attend. We just have to know that there's a place for us. And I'm like, absolutely, there's a place. Because the longer they're there, sitting in rows, going to Sunday school, sitting in small groups, the more time we're giving God to do spiritual heart surgery. And I don't know about your testimony. I'm sure it's amazing, but I know this about my testimony. Spiritual heart surgery takes time. Getting people to a place takes time. And I don't want to jumpstart what God does, okay? Distinguish between people and their ideas. Too many of our people in our congregation will talk about, the extremist of the LGBTQ community, and then they will just somehow transpose that thinking onto an individual that they meet that might be same-sex attracted, and they don't know that person might be celibate. There are a lot of people who are same-sex attracted who are celibate. There are a lot of people that struggle with gender dysphoria that will never transition. But there are a lot of Christians who automatically transpose the worst of the extremist ideas onto these people. You've got to teach them not to do that. We have to move ahead of society by distinguishing between people and ideologies. People are not their ideologies. People are not their opinions. Okay? Assume, now some of you are going to say this. You might say, I don't have any LGBTQ people in my church. Well, you probably do. You just don't know about it. You're like, no, I would know. No. It shocked my mom's family. And she came from a small town up in northern Kansas, Seneca. It shocked my dad's family when they found out he came from a town of like 200 called Mullinville, Kansas, in western Kansas, which Roy Weiss used to call Western Kansas heaven. And I think we found Roy Weiss's weakness and sinfulness, because only a sinner would really call Western Kansas heaven, because it's not. It is not. It is purgatory, if anything. It's not exactly hell. That's Phoenix. But no, seriously, I was there last summer, like in August. There was 119 standing in line, pay inside at this convenience store. The guy behind me starts talking to me. I don't even know what he looks like. I didn't turn around. He just starts talking to me. I'm like, oh, do we have to do this? And so I turn around and start talking. He's like, oh, nice weather, huh? I said, it's 119. And he's like, here's what the audacity he had to say. Well, it's a dry heat. I'm like, well, so is fire. Fire's dry. I'm not saying, oh, it's a great day to burn my hand. No. You have to assume that LGBTQ plus people are listening because there are a lot of people that have not come out to you that still go to your church. And there will be people that shock you. Okay? Some are in the closet. Some are out of the closet. Some might be in relationships you may not know of. Some might be celibate out of their conviction, but they haven't told anybody about how they feel. Some people are confused, and they feel ashamed, and they don't want to tell anybody. Okay? Number 4. Reveal commonalities in your sermon. Like sermons, you already know this, should never be about what we're against. Okay? It is about what we're for. Okay? So, it really helps to show your congregation's commonalities. For instance, everybody that you see is a sexual being. Everybody. And everybody you see is a broken sexual being. Those are commonalities. You know, the LGBTQ community or I say that and they're not, I'm just saying for lack of a better phrase, that environment and the Christian environment, the Christian community, evangelical, Catholic, conservative Christians, whatever you want to call over here, and then the community over here, there are a lot of commonalities. Like, for instance, we're both very passionate about our message. We both kind of have an apologetic methodology about our message. We have our own books. We have our own comedians. Ours are better. We have our own movies. Neither are good. We have our own music. Ours are better. We have Crowder still, I think. Is he alive still? I was worried about that guy. There's a lot we have in common. Okay? Number 5. When you preach, share stories. Listen, I know many of you are going to do that when you preach anyway, but share stories. And they don't have to be your stories. They could be other stories. They could be stories of people that you know. Just get their permission if you use their name or change their name. You're like, Caleb, isn't that lying? No, that's not lying. That's protecting. Okay? You can even acknowledge that in your sermon. Say, I'm changing the name of this individual or whatever. Now, this individual should not be sitting in the front row because everybody's going to be like, that's Earl. Don't do that. Don't do that. I made the mistake of telling a story about my wife once and did not get her permission. Never again. I came home and I'm like, what's wrong? She's like, well, if you don't know, I'm not going to tell you. And I said, well, we're going to be sitting here a long time then. Because then now we have to play 20 questions. And eventually I figured out what it was. Get permission or change the names. And if you do tell a story of somebody, make sure they are a few states away if you don't have their permission. You know, like a state nobody goes to, like West Virginia. Here's another thing. You can film testimonies of people or show testimonies from other churches. Or if there's a testimony in your church and somebody wants to share that, film it. But, you know, before you show it, pause, think twice, slow down, and think 3 more times. And then think about this. As there are people that are eager to share their testimony. And a lot of the times, I love hearing the testimonies, okay? But you know what my main concern is? Number 1, are they ready to share it? Because then I think there's spiritual warfare associated with that when they do. But number 2, like, are they ready for the people in the church that might try to come and fix them all of a sudden? Now, again, I know you probably don't have anybody at your churches that are extra grace required, EGRs, right? Those are all the churches up north, or over in Hannibal, Missouri, something like that. Those are that Hannibal, good night. I was there at nighttime once, and that was terrifying. But I will say this. You need to really think through this with them and ask questions to yourself like, will they regret it? Will people in the congregation try to evangelize their view or their experience? Will others automatically make a lot of negative assumptions about them? Are they ready to handle possible criticism like that? And here's another one. Will they be ready for people coming to them for advice? Like, seriously. Like, they will be the resident gay expert in your church in that moment. And you got to make sure that they are ready for the onslaught of what could happen, okay? Number 6, when you're preaching, you need to make sure that you're highlighting the tension of grace and truth, not the confusion of grace and truth. You need to highlight the tension of grace and truth, not the confusion of grace and truth. Okay? The tension of grace and truth never excuses a lack of biblical clarity. Now, some of you may have seen this. Let me tell you what I'm talking about. Some of the times when I preach about this, I will do the rubber band illustration. Anybody ever seen the rubber band illustration? Some of you have, some of you haven't. John 1:14 and 17 say Jesus Christ came full of both grace and truth. And I'll say, Jesus had both, but we naturally are either all about the grace or all about the truth. Right? We are. You know that. And you usually marry somebody that is the opposite of you, okay? I'm more about the truth. My wife is more about the grace. And it takes a lot for me to stretch over to the grace side at times, and it takes a lot for her to stretch over the truth side at times. Usually that's how it goes. Not all the time, but usually. But, the reason why people take sides between grace and truth is because it takes no effort on your part to be your muscle habit. It's actually spiritual laziness. Like, you'll go to heaven, but don't call yourself a mature believer. Because a mature believer does not take sides between grace and truth. A mature believer stands for both. Just like Jesus came in both grace and truth. Just like you see in John chapter 3, when Jesus talked to Nicodemus, he starts with truth and ends with grace. And in John chapter 4, the woman at the well, he starts with grace and ends with truth. And you see that motif throughout John. And so, I tell people there's a name for this tension in the middle of grace and truth, and it's love. Love is the tension of grace and truth. It's powerful. See, there's no power when you're just holding the rubber band by one side. No power whatsoever. There's an immense amount of power when you are stuck in the middle. And so, when you think about this, there's another name for this tension in the middle. It's the human experience. It's where we live out the days of our life. Wow, that sounded like a soap opera. It's where we live out and experience the progression of our days. And you think about this, because I was talking, and I don't think they would mind my saying this, because they got in some hot water over a conference. I was talking with North Point Church in Atlanta not too long ago. I was down there consulting with them. And I was like, when you think about, I pulled out the rubber band. I said, when you think about the tension of grace and truth, you guys kind of, because they're non-affirming. They are. Like, a lot of their policies are. It doesn't seem like it, but they are. Big time. But that's not how they present. And so there are a lot of LGBTQ people that at times feel catfished a bit. Spiritually catfished. They're like, well, why are you just now telling me this, and that kind of thing. And there is a time and a place and everything like that. But one of the points that I made is that, you can't just say, well, tension of grace and truth, so we're not going to be very descriptive of that. No. Notice this. To have tension in the middle, you have to have a firm grasp on grace, and you have to have a firm grasp on truth. That is the only way you create tension. The tension is not in the grace, and the tension is not in the truth. The tension is in the human experience, and the grace and the truth are the boundaries. Does that make sense? The grace and the truth are the boundaries, and that's why I say you have to make sure that you are allowing the tension of grace and truth, but not the confusion of grace and truth. Does that make sense? There's a big difference, because you'll never have tension unless you have a firm grasp on both sides. Because once you have a mediocre grasp, it all falls apart on one or the other. You either like everything's okay, or you're like everybody's not okay over here. Okay? You got to make sure that you understand that tension only exists when two well-defined objects or ideas are pulling in opposite directions. Real quick, I want to rush through this because I want to honor my time. And maybe I'll finish some of this in my next session and then go on to something else, because we're not doing discussion right after this. So I've got 2 minutes. So I'll say this. How you, number 7, I think, or 6, or whatever, letter E or F, whatever you're on. How you say something is as important as what you say. Now, we know that for preaching, but when we teach and preach on lightning rod societal issues that have biblical connections, a lot of the times our emotional intelligence will go out the window, because we'll be nervous, or we think we know it, and that kind of thing, and we don't do the same kind of preparation that we might do for other, sermons. Okay? The next one, number 8, I think. Here's some questions to ask when studying a passage on sex, gender, and etc. Okay? When you dig into the text, ask questions like this. What does the passage teach about sexuality? Where, if any, in the passage did you notice the intersection of grace and truth in regards to sexuality, gender, or related topics? What warnings about sexuality and gender and relationships and lust are in the passage? What promises are made? What hope is offered? Is there somebody in the text that is doing something that people should replicate or not replicate? Are there any negative consequences? Here are questions to ask when you think about your audience. Number 1, and a big question is this. With what I say, how might an LGBTQ plus person hear this? How might a lesbian couple hear this? How might a student who is confused about their sexuality and hiding it, how are they going to hear my words? Now, I'm not saying you lighten the gospel or change it, but I'm saying posture matters. Words matter. I've heard some preachers say, well, words, they really don't, matter. You just got to say what you got to say. Well, they seem to matter to God because he wrote out the word in 3 different languages and allowed each author to use their own context, so on and so forth, to do that. How is the single mom who just got divorced and hates men, how is she going to hear what you have to say? What hope can you offer her? What about somebody who is in a secret relationship and just wants to get out of it and they don't know how to, and they're afraid if they tell somebody they're going to be shunned? How are they going to hear what you have to say? When I preach on something like this, I usually like to sit down and picture myself at a table like this with all these different people and all these different life situations and think to myself, what are they going to say? What are they going to think if I say it like this? And you know what? Sometimes I should say it like this, despite what they might say. But a lot of the times I might say, you know what? I can maybe say it like this. And that would get the point across more. So I'm not as much worried about it's just, it's going to wreck everything. I'm more worried about, what I'm going to say, can I say it in such a way where I don't compromise the gospel? And it might be difficult for them to hear, but I don't want it to destroy them. Does that make sense? Because you can present the truth in a way that destroys people, and Jesus never did that, except to the Pharisees, but he had good reason to, He didn't do that to the woman at the well. He didn't do that to the woman caught in adultery. And if you think about it, he didn't even do that to the Pharisees in John 8. He could have thrown a stone at them. But he didn't. He gave them the same grace that he gave this woman in John chapter 8. What might some of their insecurities be about hearing a sermon like this? Because sometimes it's even good to acknowledge that in your sermon. Say, listen, I know in a crowd like this, despite how many people are here. There's some of you who are touched by this subject. Either you might be wrestling with this secretly, or you know somebody in your family. You work with somebody. You have a neighbor. You have friends. And you really want to be there with them, but you feel this tension where you don't want to, feel like you're turning your back on God. Then ask a couple more questions. I'll end with these couple more questions, and maybe I'll come back to this in session 3. I would ask this. How might people, when you preach your sermon, in your sermon, how might people be inspired to follow Jesus? Here's another question. How might people be inspired to keep following Jesus despite their internal struggle, despite the tension they feel between their friends and family and their faith? What can you say that could inspire them to either start following Jesus or to continue following Jesus?